Hi everybody. Tonight we're going to talk about the market for labor. Here are a couple things to start us off. First of all, we're all suppliers of labor. All of us who are in the job market. We supply labor to firms who need or demand it, and the price at which we supply labor equals the going wage. So I will work for whatever the going wage is. Now, the choice to work is a cost-benefit trade-off, of course, because this is economics. The cost in that trade-off is leisure time given up, so things I could have been doing had I been not working. The benefit is the dollars that I earn that I can use to get the things I want and need. Now, how do we decide how much we're going to work? Well, you will work the next hour if the marginal utility of the wage exceeds the marginal utility of leisure you give up. What does that mean? Well, it means if the money I'm earning exceeds the value or utility of whatever I could have been doing instead of working. And the flip side happens if the marginal utility of the wage is less than the marginal utility of whatever it is I gave up. So equilibrium occurs where marginal utility of the wage equals marginal utility of leisure, or rather this is work, and the wage associated with work equaling the marginal utility of labor. Now, let's talk about the overall supply of labor. So how much will I work? Well, will I really work more if I get paid more? It's a good question. It depends on something called the substitution effect and the income effect. On the left-hand side here, you see a curve that represents what happens if the substitution effect is dominating the income effect. The substitution effect says, basically, if I get paid more, I will work more. The income effect on the other side says that as I get paid more, I'll work less. And the rationale there is it takes fewer hours of work to buy the things that I need. Now, generally speaking, and history has shown that the substitution effect dominates, although there have been times where the income effect dominated. Most times we will associate the labor supply curve as an upward sloping curve, not a downward sloping curve. There are four factors that shift the labor supply curve. What I'm going to do, rather than going through each of these, I've done what I think are pretty good examples here. So just go ahead and pause and read through this, and then when you're done, hit play and we'll continue the lesson. Let's talk about equilibrium in the labor market. So this figure shows the labor market as a whole. The market labor demand curve, so here, like the demand curve for a good, is the horizontal sum, remember, horizontal sum of all the individual labor demand curves of all the firms that hire labor in this particular market. And recall that a price-taking firm's labor demand curve is the same as its value of the marginal product of labor curve. And as we discussed above, the market labor supply curve is generally upward sloping. So the equilibrium wage rate is the wage rate at which the quantity of labor supplied is equal to the quantity of labor demanded, right here. So this leads to an equilibrium wage rate right here. So again, demand for labor slopes downward as firms employ fewer workers at higher wages. Makes sense. Supply of labor slopes up as people supply more labor and more people work at those higher wages. And the market wage is the value of the marginal product of the last unit of labor hired. Let's talk about what happens when the product market is not perfectly competitive. Well, when the market is perfectly competitive, just remember as background, the wage rate is equal to the value of the marginal product of labor at equilibrium. In other market structures like monopoly, the demand curve for the product faced by the monopolist slopes downward. This means that to sell that additional unit of output, the monopolist has to lower the price. And as a result, the additional revenue received from selling one more unit is not simply the price like it was for a perfect competitor. Remember the horizontal demand curve in a perfectly competitive market. MR equals price equals demand. Now, for a monopolist, the additional revenue from selling one more unit is less than the price by the amount of the price effect explained previously. Remember that, the decreased revenue on units that could have been sold at a higher price if the price hadn't been lowered to sell another unit. So how does this affect hiring? Well, to determine its demand for workers, the monopolist has to multiply the marginal product of labor, so you can see here the marginal product of labor, by the marginal revenue received from selling the additional output. This is called the marginal revenue product of labor, or the MRPL. And keep in mind here, look at this, unlike a perfectly competitive market, look what's happening as each additional worker comes on, creating more output, selling more units, the price is decreasing. And you'll remember that's what derives the marginal revenue curve for our monopolist. And again, just note how that price decreases. It's an important difference. So if that's the case, and a monopolist has to consider that marginal revenue product, not just the value of the marginal product of labor, what ends up happening when we consider the wage and the quantity of labor? Well, what will happen is fewer units of labor will be employed if the firms in the product market have pricing power than if they are price takers. What does that mean? This is price taker market, right? Perfectly competitive, versus a monopolist who not only is going to price at that intersection of marginal revenue and marginal cost, and don't worry about marginal cost right here for right now, you'll notice that the number of units of labor employed at this wage will be less than if it were a perfectly competitive market. And what you're seeing here is one of the inherent inefficiencies, again, associated with monopoly production, hiring fewer workers, having a lower demand for workers. Okay, well, what happens when the labor market is not perfectly competitive? So we talked about the product market in the case of monopolist. Well, in the case of monopsony, that's a new word for us, a single employer can dominate a market or industry. So unlike perfect competition, where any single employer is way too small to impact the wage, just like they're way too small to impact the price of the product, a monopsonist can exert influence over the wage. So let's talk about characteristics of a labor market monopsony. There are three that are important. First of all, there's only a single buyer of a type of labor, so think employer. The type of labor is relatively immobile. Think about somebody in a remote mining town not really having the ability to easily pick up, move, and go work somewhere else. The firm is also a wage maker, meaning the wage it must pay varies with the number of workers employed. What that says is that in order to employ more workers, you have to increase the wage. Now, in the case of pure monopsony, the firm's labor supply curve is the same as the industry labor supply curve. That's like monopoly, where a monopoly firm has the same curve as the market because it is the market. Importantly, the additional cost associated with the additional unit of labor is the marginal factor cost of labor. Factor cost of labor basically is think about the cost of that labor as a factor to production. Marginal factor cost of labor is the additional cost associated with the additional unit of labor. In perfect competition, the marginal factor cost of labor is always equal to the wage, because as I hire somebody in that perfectly competitive market, what happens? I hire whatever the going wage is. So that marginal factor cost of labor is equal to the wage. In a monopsony, the marginal factor cost of labor is higher than the wage. How does that work? Well, let's look through it a little bit. Here's a chart that explains how this works. So if I have imperfect competition in a market, so an imperfect competitor, what happens? In order to get more people to work for me, I need to increase the wage. Part of the characteristics of a monopsonist or a market where I have imperfect competition. Quantity of labor goes up. I have to increase the wage to get more people to work. And here, look what happens with my total labor cost. So as I raise the wage to hire more workers, I have to pay that higher wage to all of the workers, not just the new workers. So I have to also include those that were working at a lower wage. So the marginal factor cost of labor here actually includes the higher wage to the marginal worker plus the increase in wages of the workers who were being paid the lower wage before. So take an example. The marginal factor cost of labor for the fourth worker equals 9 for the fourth worker, plus a $1 increase for all of those who are working at a lower wage. Now, importantly, by the time you got to the fourth, everybody else would have been making 8 already, because to go from 6 to 7, you would have had to raise this guy's wage to 7. to go from 7 to 8, you would have had to raise these guys' wages to 8. And to go from 8 to 9, then you're taking these. So this person is going to be making 9, and you'd have to raise this from 8 to 9, this from 8 to 9, and this from 8 to 9. So the marginal factor cost of that labor is actually $12, 9 plus 1 times those 3 workers. So be careful when you're doing that calculation for the marginal factor cost of labor. Don't read just the earlier employee's original wages. So what does that end up looking like when we draw a graph for it? Well, the marginal factor cost of labor is greater than the marginal labor supply curve because the marginal cost of hiring that additional unit of labor exceeds the wage rate. And here we can see that again. Well, here's the wage rate. For example, the 4th worker, the wage rate is 9, but look at the marginal cost associated with bringing that 4th worker on because you had to give everybody else a raise. So this is what your marginal factor cost of labor and market labor supply curves look like. Well, why is this important? Well, it's important because equilibrium in the imperfectly competitive labor market is different than a perfectly competitive labor market. And here's what happens. Here, and let me start by quickly looking here. So the demand for labor sloping down. This is a perfectly competitive market. Supplier labor sloping up, and we hire at a point of equilibrium, right? Well, let's take a look at what happens in the case of the monopsonist. Well, we'll hire workers until the marginal revenue product of labor, right here, marginal revenue product of labor here equals the marginal factor cost of labor rather than the intersection of the market labor supply curve and the market labor demand curve. Why? Well, because the monopolist is looking to do what? The monopolist is looking to hire up to a point where you have intersections of marginal factor cost of labor, so that's my marginal cost, and my marginal revenue product of labor. Well, look at this. Importantly, I'll hire at this level, but look at the wage I pay. Why do I only have to pay this wage? Well, because this is the market labor supply curve. I won't hire out to this point because I have a marginal factor cost of labor that exceeds the market labor supply curve at every point. And instead, I will hire this number of employees, and I will hire them at this wage. Okay. 2 slides of key economic concepts for this module. I'm already way over time, so I'm going to let you pause and read this. Okay, let's go to the next one, and I'll pause and let you read this. We'll go over all of this in class tomorrow. Have a great night, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.